Hello! In this video I'm going to explain briefly some of the work we've done in the last 5 years carrying out a programme of research called the CVI Project. CVI stands for Cerebral Visual Impairment, and we have carried out studies looking firstly at how many children in primary schools have visual problems connected with CVI. Secondly, what is the impact for the children and their families of having CVI? And thirdly, can we introduce a service into primary schools to help them support children with CVI? So when we test vision in our clinics, the first thing we usually do is distance visual acuity, which means how far down a chart like this somebody can read. Now these are black letters on a white background, it's flat and it's still. But most of the world is not like that. Most of the world is like what we see in the fish tank. There's motion, there's different levels of colour, contrast, and we need to recognise different types of objects. And these aspects of vision are not measured by this kind of chart, and much of these types of vision are controlled by the networks in the brain. In the eye clinic, we examine people's eyes on this machine called a slit lamp, and we can see the front of the eye and inside the eye very clearly. So the visual system, as well as the eye, which lets the light in, as we've seen, comprises lots of the brain. And these MRI scans from a paper by Maria Martin et al. Show this beautifully. In this first picture here, this is a brain of a person with no visual problems, and you can see these coloured areas are all the different areas and networks involved with vision. The occipital cortex here at the back is where the messages from the eye first arrive, and then these other fibres conduct the information to all the different parts of the brain. And you can see that in this scan of a person who has had a serious eye problem from birth, and so being blind from birth, there's much less activity here in the occipital cortex, but the networks are still intact. And we know, in fact, that in many people, hearing and touch input can feed into the occipital cortex to give some of the information that's missing from the lack of sight. By contrast, in this scan of a child with CVI, the networks are much less well formed. Even if in many cases the occipital cortex is fine, the networks just aren't there. And this is the kind of problem we're talking about. And many people have written about this in scientific papers and other more popular descriptions. And one particularly good one is by Bill Bryson in his book, The Body, where, as he says, what we see is not what's there, but what our brain tells us is probably there based on the activities of these networks. So if you have a problem with the networks, you may not see quite what the people around you think you see. In our first study, we wanted to find out how many children had vision problems that might indicate CVI. We recruited a dozen primary schools, and from each of them, we got information about which children were having extra help with their learning. We also asked all the teachers to fill in a standard questionnaire about the children's behaviour. We sent out equivalent questionnaires to the parents asking about the children's behaviour at home. This information was used to tell us which children were at higher risk of having CVI, and we regarded those children as having a red flag. And we invited all children with a red flag to have a detailed visual assessment on school premises. As well, we invited a randomly selected 5% of children with no red flags to come and have a vision test to avoid stigmatising children just because they were invited. Over 500 children were invited to have their vision test, but less than that, only approximately half, came in with a consent form signed by their parents, and those were the children who had the detailed visual assessment on school premises. When we had done all the vision tests, we found that 78 children had CVI-related vision problems. If these were distributed evenly amongst all the classes, this would equal about one child in every class. But in fact, we found the children were not distributed evenly and were heavily concentrated amongst the group who were having extra help with their learning, of whom over 40% had CVI-related vision problems. We found that 3/4 of the children with the vision problems were having extra help, although people didn't know that they had vision problems. But equally, 1/4 of children with the CVI related vision problems were not having extra help and seemed to manage fine at school, but were more likely to show their distress or have problems in their home life. So in our first study, we found that rather more children than had been previously suspected had vision problems that might indicate cerebral visual impairment. The next study we went on to do was to look at the impact of cerebral visual impairment for families and to see what they thought and professionals thought were the main outcomes to try and improve in affected children. In study 2, we carried out a core outcome set project. This involved reviewing the literature to see what outcomes relating to CVI had already been used in studies, and interviewing children and families where a child had CVI and asking them what were the most important outcomes of life they would like to be improved by an intervention that was aimed at improving a child's CVI. All of these different potential outcomes were put into an email survey and people were asked to rank them in importance. There were 2 rounds of this email survey and 80 participants conducted both rounds. Approximately 2/3 of the participants were professionals and 1/3 were family members. At the end of the project, we had a consensus meeting where 3 of the professionals and 2 of the family members discussed the results from the email survey and agreed the final core outcome set. At the consensus meeting, we discussed and the participants agreed a final set of 15 outcomes that were important to try and improve in the lives of children with CVI. These were wide-ranging and many of them were quite broad concepts. The most important were community and social life or relationships and learning and accessing materials to do that. There were some visual abilities that were featured in the top 15, and these were consistency of visual performance, managing in a crowded environment, and ability to deal with crowded or cluttered scenes. Also very important was relevant adults being aware of CVI. Then a number of other general features of a child's life and well-being were rated as important. The results were very surprising, I thought. It was interesting that everybody who voted put community and social life or social relationships and learning at the top of their list as the most important outcomes to be improved in the lives of children with CVI. And the thing that also struck me was the importance the families and the professionals put on adults being more aware of CVI, better knowledge of the condition. And this was right up here. 4 people had it in their top 10.
For me, the most surprising thing was the vision and testing visual acuity, because that's my job. That's what I do. But it's interesting to see how much less important it was to parents in particular. Maybe that's the way we test vision. And from what parents have described, it's changed my view of testing vision, particularly in more complex children, and it's looking at more how they see the world in general rather than just reading down a vision chart.
Based on our clinical experience and on the results of the core outcome set, we devised a CVI intervention pack to share with schools information about CVI. In our third study, our aim was to investigate the feasibility and the acceptability of our CVI intervention pack and of the study methods we proposed to use in a real-world classroom setting. We recruited 7 primary schools. We collected baseline information in questionnaires filled in by the children, the teachers, their parents, and the schools in the autumn of 2019. The schools were then randomised into 2 groups. One group of schools continued with life as normal. The other group of schools received our CVI intervention pack. This pack contained some information for teachers about CVI, some universal and targeted strategies to help children with CVI or vision problems, some teaching material for the children to use in lessons, and a clinical pathway for children to get eye tests at the local clinic. Our intention was to collect follow-up data using the same questionnaires in the summer of 2020. The results from Study 3 were affected by the pandemic. When the schools reopened after the closures, 2 of our schools left. We were able to collect questionnaires from the remaining schools, from children and teachers. We were also able to collect interviews with teachers and parents and their comments about the intervention and the methods. The intervention-related comments were that the content of the teacher's information pack was good. The advice about decluttering classrooms elicited some mixed responses, and the materials for use in children's lessons to raise awareness about vision were felt to be useful. There was a strong preference for vision tests to be on-site rather than involving a referral to the eye clinic. The comments about the study methods were that the questionnaires were fine for both the children and for the teachers. The responses from the parent questionnaires were low, suggesting it was probably too long. However, vouchers to parents increased the return rate. Finally, the use of photographic methods to collect data would need standardising for use in a wider study. So in our third study, which was obviously affected by the pandemic, we still learnt a great deal that was useful about schools and teachers' responses to the information pack we put together and about how to carry out this kind of research with primary schools. I'd like to end with a few words from one of the mums on our parent advisory group who have been so supportive to this research. Her daughter has been diagnosed with cerebral visual impairment and is now a young lady. The statement that this mum sent us really clearly covers some of the areas we've talked about. She said that even today we are still trying to explain to professionals how it affects day-to-day life. It's massive. She says that her daughter was eventually diagnosed at the age of 10 and referred to the eye hospital, and since then we've not looked back. All the pieces of the puzzle slipped into place. Once the campaign started for appropriate support, there was an immediate improvement in behaviour, which we now know is affected by fear. We always knew that there was something not diagnosed, and we could have avoided years of inappropriate referrals to professionals and the costs involved. Acceptance, confidence and self-esteem would have been realised so much sooner, and progress would have been so much greater. So we know that for that little girl, who's now a young lady, finding her CVI and helping to support her with it has been really good. But not all children get that. And this research and research of other colleagues who are working in the same area is to try and make sure all children have a similarly positive outcome. Thank you.